Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Asalaamu Alaikum. Greetings of peace. My name is Safir Ahmed, and I am the Director of Publications at Zaytuna College. And it is my incredible honor tonight to welcome all of you in this room and those of you watching online to what is essentially the last of the fall lecture series of Zaytuna College. And we have an appropriate guest for that last series, who is also a longtime friend of Zaytuna College as well as a neighbor. But before we get into that, I do want to say a couple of quick things. The format for tonight's program will be, I will welcome our guest and he'll give a talk. At the end of the talk, we'll have a little Q&A session. So feel free to come up. There'll be a microphone here to come up and ask questions. We'll also take some questions from people online as well. And hopefully have an interesting amount of questions based on the talk that he gives us, which I think will be very provocative and thought-provoking, certainly. So the topic for tonight's talk is really the study of Islam and Muslims in academia. It has to do with the public discourse that's going on out there about Islam and Muslims, and what are the pressures on that, where does that come from, and how is it affecting people in academia in the study of Islamic studies in academia. And of course, academia is not one monolithic thing. There are different aspects of academia as well, and I think Dr. Jiwa will walk us through that. And I think I want to say a few things about Dr. Jiwa before I bring him up here, because he's incredibly qualified to talk about the things that he's going to talk about tonight. He is the founding director of the Center for Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union, and also the associate professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology. He holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia and an MTS from Harvard Divinity School. His research interests include Islam and Muslims in the West, Islamophobia, media, art and aesthetics, secularism, and religious formations. Among many things he's done, he's also worked at for a non-governmental organization, NGOs as they're called at the UN, on interfaith and youth programs, and he's been in Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Japan, and many parts of the Middle East. Currently, he's also serving on the Islamic Studies Advisory Group for Public Education at Stanford University, and on various committees and boards at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Jiwa received the GTU's Excellence in Teaching Award in 2015, and he has a forthcoming work that's titled Politics of Exhibition, Artists and Muslim Identity in New York City. The last thing I'll say is that first thing I mentioned was he's the founding director for the Center of Islamic Studies. Well, it's an auspicious day, tomorrow at least, and this month, because tomorrow is the 10th year anniversary celebration of the Center for Islamic Studies at the GTU Library. So for those of you who are in town, please, you're welcome to attend that. It goes from 4:30 to 8:30 p.m. It's an exhibition tour, there's presentations and a reception. And this is Dr. Munir Jiwa's work, and in his 10 years of work establishing this and continuing with that. And so without further ado, let me just please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Munir Jiwa.
Alaikum, and thank you for all being here, and thank you, Safir, for that generous introduction and making the plug for the 10th year anniversary of the center. I also want to thank all those who have been involved with this lecture series, and there have been amazing lectures all throughout the semester, so I just hope that it'll continue. We've all had an opportunity to learn a lot from a really wide range of topics that you've brought together here. I also want to thank Mohammed and Harun for their work on putting this event together, and Dr. Hatem as well for inviting me. I thought what I might do, just because it's a little more intimate of an audience here, that I would speak to you a little bit about the sort of larger frames and how we are thinking about Islamic studies in academia today, but related to how we think about and do Islamic studies is the question of what does this actually mean in terms of Islam and for Muslims as well. So there are questions of insider and outsider boundaries within academia and outside, the various disciplines and departments we're in. And so many of the examples I'll give are really from the context of a theological institution like the GTU. So our Center for Islamic Studies, for example, is an academic center, but it's a center that's in a largely interreligious environment where we have several ecumenical Christian seminaries and some that are non-denominational. And then we have in that sort of consortium, Center for Dharma Studies, Center for Jewish Studies, Center for the Arts and Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. So this consortium makes certain kinds of possibilities available in terms of Islamic studies that other institutions don't. So one of the things I'll be referring to throughout my talk are my own examples within a theological institution. And those are often, as I said, differentiated from the kinds of Islamic studies that can happen in public institutions, public universities, and private universities. This also is differentiated by the various departments that we're in. So if you're doing sort of Islamic studies within area studies, that's a certain kind of training. If you're doing Islamic studies within anthropology, that's another kind of training. Sociology, literature, political science. These all make different kinds of demands on the scholarship itself and on the scholar, her or himself as well. So, and that that's also often related to funding. So I'll get to that in a bit as well, but there are larger questions of what can and can't be researched, and then what is eventually researched because of certain kinds of funding that are made available. So all of those are things that I want us to keep in mind as we're thinking about Islamic studies. I'm not narrowly defining it just as something that belongs in religious studies or Near East studies or Middle East studies, but to think more largely about what that means in both public and private university settings and within theological institutions. And in all of these institutions, there are various challenges and opportunities that we have in our work. One of the big things about how we think about Islam and Muslims in the world today and how that impacts Islamic studies is a kind of longer history that I want to point us to. I won't get into the details of the history of Orientalism that many of us are familiar with through Edward Said's work, but suffice it to say that the way in which we have come to think about Islam and Muslims in academia often relates to the larger kinds of histories and political contexts in which we do our studies. So if we look at the kind of longue durée, the historical durée of thinking about Islam and Muslims in the world today, it's often in the context of thinking about European knowledge and European knowledge as kind of a superior knowledge already, right? So we have Europe as the kind of place of, or the idea of, where knowledge is produced, and from which place knowledge is circulated to the world. So European knowledge is always seen as singular. It's the product of Europe and Europeans, and the second feature is that it's universal. Right? So European knowledge is often presented as both a singular history, but one that is universal, that it's a history of the world, rather than understanding it as a history that comes out of particular contexts, particular time, and particular space. This kind of knowledge, as we've seen, has divided the world into what we loosely call East and West, right? So Europe as the West, and with the West comes its opposite, the East. So as Edward Said's critique would be, that the idea of Orientalism and the idea of imagining the world in these binaries of East and West are not just physical divides, but they're also imaginary ones, epistemological ones, in which European knowledge has come to be seen as superior knowledge, and the knowledge in which all then have to find themselves within. Part of that knowledge is also the division of East and West in kind of more evaluative terms, right? So European knowledge becomes knowledge that is, again, superior. All other knowledges are seen as inferior, right? If the West is seen as scientific, rational, advanced, modern, Eastern knowledges, including Oriental, what used to be called Oriental sort of lands, and these, what we more loosely call the Muslim majority world, is seen as its opposite, or it's at least constructed as its opposite. So if the West comes to be rational, scientific, less religious, secular, intellectual, the East then becomes its opposite. So irrational, unscientific, magical, spiritual, and not capable of producing the same kind of knowledge. So this stark division between what we've come to see as East and West has a massive impact in the way in which we think about Islam and Muslims, both within and outside the academy. So one is this kind of spatial frame of how we think about the world in East and West binaries. And added to that spatial frame is a temporal frame, right? There's a way in which if the West is all those things that I said it was, it's also seen as progressive, right? Moving forward in time. And with that comes the East as regressive, right? So Europe becomes not just the place by which we sort of measure the world spatially, but we also use Europe as the way in which we think about the world temporally, right? So when we deem people to be backwards, or we deem their traditions to be backwards, what is it in backwards to? What are we comparing that to, and to whom? Right, so I think the temporal dimension is a really critical one. We often see it, as we said, sometimes unchallenged in terms like progressive, this propensity to move forward as if that somehow makes us more modern, and the rest of the world kind of lagging behind. We see that in more specific ways as well. You know, the advent of the calendar, the Gregorian calendar, shaped the world in certain ways. We all sort of work within a kind of 9 to 5 time frame, on Western time frame. So if you live in other parts of the world, you often adjust your clocks to the West, work within these 9 to 5 sort of hours, which kind of we see as the kind of rise of labor, and where 9 to 5 is a working hour. But this kind of timing of the world and the calendar that we use and the way in which we even live out the days of our week, right? In this part of the world, it's a Monday to Friday. In other parts of the world, it isn't so. Or that we've come to think of Saturday for many as a Sabbath, Sunday as a day of rest. These are not uniformly and universally understood to be the same, right? So these all make different kinds of demands, including the way in which we think about, as I mentioned, the calendars that we use, right? So the fact that we have a Gregorian calendar which maps out the world, well, there are many sort of competing, or at least calendars that work at the same time, including the Jewish and Islamic ones in terms of a lunar calendar, right? But the calendar also marks other things as well, right? It marks our days differently. So if those who kind of live according to a kind of spiritual worldview in which the days are marked by prayer, that's a very different kind of day, where your days are not punctuated by prayer, or even assembled or aligned according to the prayer times, but according to work times, right? These are deep divisions in how we think about the world. So cyclical or spiritual or other kinds of times compete with the kind of more homogeneous times that we see in the West. All of this and the kind of Enlightenment thinking around how the world ought to be lived has a very particular provincial European history, right? And as I said, it's this provincial and parochial history of Europe is then seen as the history of the world. And we tend to think of this as always having been the case. So in the West, when we think of sort of the Enlightenment and the fact that the less religion we have, the more likely we are able to navigate a secular public sphere in a way that's fair and equal to all. So the important question I think that Talal Asad and others have asked, Professor Sabah Mahmood and others, about the secularism is thought of in different ways, right? The secular as an idea, as an epistemological category, and then secularism as a particular kind of political doctrine, right? What are the connections, as Professor Asad has asked? And I just want to begin with asking to read out work from his really important work. Both his works, his books, Genealogies of Religion and Formations of the Secular, are must-reads. But this is how he asked the question about secularism. What is the connection between the secular as an epistemic category and secularism as a political doctrine? Secularism as a political doctrine arose in modern Euro-America. It is easy to think of it simply as requiring the separation of religious from secular institutions in government, but that is not all it is. Abstractly stated, examples of this separation can be found in medieval Christendom and in the Islamic empires, and no doubt elsewhere too. But what is distinctive about secularism is that it proposes new concepts of religion, ethics, and politics, and new imperatives associated with them. Many people have sensed this novelty and reacted to it in a variety of ways. Thus, the opponents of secularism in the Middle East and elsewhere have rejected it as specific to the West, while its advocates have insisted that its particular origin does not detract from its contemporary global relevance. And then he does a kind of critique of Charles Taylor and his work. In Professor Mahmoud's work, she takes it to another level where she says this about secularism, and this is from her really important work on, it was a 2006 publication called Secularism, Hermeneutics, and Empire, The Politics of Islamic Reformation. And this is what she says, and I just use these as sort of frames that we might think about throughout the discussion. The antipathy that progressive secular intellectuals exhibit towards those forms of religiosity glossed as orthodox or traditional is often, paradoxically, conjoined with a certain commitment to the poetic resources of the Judeo-Christian tradition, evident in a literary and aesthetic sensibility, albeit denuded from the requirements of prophecy, doctrine, and traditional authority. This antipathy towards traditional religious authority has many earlier precedents, including Marx, who argued that the dissolution of the religious claim was a necessary precursor for human emancipation to proceed. The certainty of this critical stance has to be attenuated by a recognition of the paucity and parochialism of this universalist vision, both because of the historical disasters it has facilitated and because of the manner in which it is currently cavorting with one of the most ambitious imperial projects in history, which seeks to make the world in a singular image. Such a total project, I fear, can only elicit an equally singular vision in response, one in which all shades of interpretive, moral, and ethical ambiguity must be leveled so as to salvage the dregs of what might have once constituted a tradition or a life world. And by that, she's sort of showing that the rise of secularism or its normative claims on the world often go unquestioned. We often think of secular norms as just givens, and it's often the religious and religious traditions that have to do the answering for their norms. We often think of secular norms, for example, as ones that are ones that promote peace and possibilities in a public sphere, and we often, by that same token, think of religious norms as restrictive, as oppressive, right? Whenever people think of doctrine, we never apply that, we often apply that to just religion. We never generally think of secular doctrine, right? We never think of, so again, secularism is just this given, and what these scholars and many others are arguing is that we need to think and pause and reflect on how secularism itself is a particular kind of history, a particular kind of political unfolding that happens in a specific time and place in Europe, in which the entire world then has to succumb as evidence of their modernity or having arrived into modernity. So this has this kind of large sort of bifurcation of East and West, both temporally and spatially, makes huge demands also in the academic world. I want to shift a little bit now to my own sort of experience within kind of theological institute like the GTU, and sort of cite what many of you have already heard in terms of my 5 media pillars of Islam, and then kind of close with some analysis. But what I want to sort of, I hope what this can do is to show that there are different demands that are made in the public about Islam. There's a kind of historical unfolding of Islam, and there's a political kind of presentist approach to how we think about Islam and Muslims, and then that again has an effect on how we think about Islam in various disciplines and fields, as I mentioned in the academy. The world in which we find ourselves today demands constant engagement and ready, thoughtful responses to increased academic queries and public requests for explanation. Serious and pressing questions from media and the public must be addressed in a timely manner, and this puts us in a crisis management mode. And I'm talking about my own experience often at the GTU and the Center for Islamic Studies. This takes an extraordinary amount of time, energy, skill, and patience, as well as it takes an emotional toll. There are also risks in scholarship, such as research topics, for example, security and terrorism studies, and travel for research, which can make a scholar a target for particular kinds of scrutiny in the West and elsewhere, especially if one is a scholar who happens to be Muslim. This has had a huge impact on academic freedom for such scholars in the US and abroad. Much needed critical scholarship on the Islamic classical tradition is too often eclipsed, while focus is centered on Islam and Muslims in contemporary political and media contexts. The ongoing global situation distinguishes the challenges faced by those in Islamic studies from those in other disciplines and areas of study for whom there is less political scrutiny of professional and personal engagements, and it considerably diminishes the time available for scholarship and publications. I very often have to navigate being seen only through my identity as a Muslim. In other words, I must be saying what I am because I'm Muslim. So Muslim becomes this kind of overarching category when Muslim scholars do their work, through which it's always a lens through which anything that they're saying is received, forgetting academic credentials or other subject positions and identities. This often puts me and minorities in general on the defensive because we are often trying to attend to both excluded histories while at the same time often being evaluated on objectivity and judged as not having sufficiently critical distance from our identities. For example, in many of my discussions in and out of the class, when I'm looking at the history of Euro-American empire and its continued violence in the world, my critiques are often viewed as coming only from Islam and my being a Muslim, rather than, for example, my training in anthropology, or, as I often joke, being a Canadian. You just go up north to get a good dose of critique of the US. So within my own fields, working within contemporary Islamic studies, teaching on topics such as secularism, modernity, liberalism, critical theory, war and violence, identity, media, art and aesthetics, Islamophobia, the politics of pluralism, religious formation, interreligious engagement, and diversity of Muslim expression, I find myself needing to work within these frames, these normative frames, through which Islam and Muslims most often get represented in the public sphere. And so this is the part that many of you may have heard. This is what I've been calling the 5 media pillars of Islam. Right? So the first pillar through which we often think about Islam and Muslims, both in the larger public sphere, but again reflected in the academy, is 9/11. So 9/11 becomes the temporal marker, the temporal frame through which we think about Islam and Muslims. Of course, the problem with this frame is that it does many problems with this frame, but a few of them are that Islam and Muslims sort of enter the public in this very negative way, right? And through this kind of negative events of 9/11, right? So it's a kind of negative entry in the public sphere. And marking 9/11 as the beginning place to think about Islam forgets the long history of Islam and Muslims who have been in the U.S., founding of the country. So, namely, African Muslims who were brought over as slaves during the Atlantic slave trade, and the long and rich history of African American Muslims who have upheld the faith in very difficult circumstances. So 9/11 is also a very political history. So when we think about 9/11, we often don't attend to other kinds of histories that are made possible, whether it's aesthetic histories, whether it's histories within other fields. It's a political, temporal category in which then Muslims are only seen in political terms. Related to 9/11 is the second frame, the frame of violence and fundamentalism, terrorism, what we call, as I often say, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Madrasa, these are all English words. They need no translation. You don't need to fix them and spell check. They just come up as English words now, right? And people across generations know these terms. You can go to elementary school kids and they know these terms, right? So again, the way in which violence and terrorism is an overarching frame, again, linked to 9/11 as a predominant frame through which we think about Islam and Muslims is often negative. But the politics around thinking about Islam and Muslims only through this frame is also problematic for a variety of reasons. One is that we think of somehow religion as being the place, or Islam being the place of that violence, right? So we tend to couch a lot of the language on fundamentalism, terrorism, and violence in general through religious terms, right? We think of it as Islamic violence or religious violence. So I would argue that this is an inaccurate way to think about violence, right? If we're thinking about violence, we need to think about the way in which Islam is mobilized by many, whether they're Muslim or not, to kind of carry out their violence in the name of Islam. So it's obvious that people will connect Islam and violence, or Muslims and terrorism, right? So today, if you say terrorism, most people immediately think Islam and Muslims, and vice versa. If you think Islam and Muslims, people think terrorism, right? So the problem with this is that we perpetuate this idea that the violence is intrinsic to or an essential part of religion itself, rather than the socio-political, historical context in which violence presents itself, right? In the military-industrial complex that we're in. The other problem with this kind of framing of kind of Islamic violence, or religious violence in particular, is that it forgets the long history of secular violence. After all, all the violence we've seen in the West is a product of, or is a part of, at the same time, the advocating of secularism, right? People can say, well, this can be also kind of Christian violence in the world. But if we just limit it to a kind of thinking around secular violence, it doesn't occur to us as something to think about, right? Because we often just attach violence to religion, or violence specifically to Islam. And we often don't think of Buddhist violence or Jewish violence or Christian violence. It's usually, at least in this kind of current climate, related to Islam only. Forgetting that the world wars have happened in the West, right? The fight for secularism happened in the West. The Holocaust has happened in the West. The genocide in Bosnia is in the West, right? Or the silence on other kinds of genocides, the Rohingyas, for example. These are all things that have happened in the West. So to not include that as part of our effort in understanding violence, I think is something we need to attend to. Why this differentiation of religious violence on the one hand, and the lack of an understanding of the violence of the sort of bloody history of secularism itself, right? The second part of this is, one can argue, is that the violence that Muslims carry out doesn't follow rules, right? It's a kind of the spectacular nature or the unanticipated nature of that violence, which makes it different from other kinds of violence, right? So this is an argument that we often hear, that there is something specific about Islamic violence, or the violence that's carried out by Muslims, because of its both spectacular nature, whether it's events of like 9/11 self, suicide bombings, that these are that they don't follow sort of certain kinds of rules. But we don't question, for example, the same on the other side. We think that the violence that we commit in the U.S., in the world, is always legitimized, right? That it follows rules. Even historically, if we think about ideas around holy war, and I don't think we can talk about holy war anymore in any tradition, given the sort of media age that we're in, where there's drones and whatnot, right? There's no such thing, right? There's no boundaries anymore. But this idea that we don't question the propensity of violence, secular violence in the world, I think needs to be challenged. And then the last part of that is what Talal Asad has written so eloquently about in his work, and especially in the work on suicide bombing, is the way in which the violence that we perpetuate in the world, from the West and to other parts of the world, is often seen as, we legitimize it in ways to say it's for their democracy, for their freedom, it's for their eventual sort of liberation, right? Violence that's committed against us is seen as its opposite. It's seen as it's evil, that it's seen as like that we're not, that we can't understand it. And yet, in some ways, when you look at the arguments made, they're often the same on various sides, right? That they also want liberation and freedom from drones. They want to be able to live their lives in peaceful ways in other parts of the world. So this idea that somehow the violence that we perpetuate in the world is somehow more moral or ethical, I think needs to be questioned. And this is the kind of different modes and how we have come in a kind of secular Western world to think about violence. It's regulated. It's only used when it absolutely needs to be. Forgetting that there's a long history of violence. We are, the largest military-industrial, weapons holders in the world. The gun violence that happens at home. This often goes unquestioned. And the violence that others perpetuate in the world is seen as somehow more important or more deadly or more evil. The third frame, I'm just going to go through these quickly so we'll have enough time for Q&A. The third frame is the frame of women and gender, and especially on debates and issues around Muslim women and veiling. And I would add to this that there are new questions that have now emerged on sexual minorities, right? So we know through Leila Ahmed's work and Laila Abu Lughod's work and Sabah Mahmood's work, all incredible professors who have written extensively about this and for many years, that there's a long colonial history of the way in which women's rights in Islam have been taken up by colonial powers in the West to save Muslim women in other parts of the world. What the preeminent post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak has said, white men saving brown women from brown men. It's a kind of sexual divide and rule to which Professor Laila Abu Lughod added, it's also white women saving brown women from brown men. So this long history, this what Leila Ahmed calls colonial feminism, is when colonial officers, European colonial officers, would go into Muslim majority lands and colonize, and they would feel so sorry for the Muslim women, and yet they would oppress or suppress the suffrage, the kind of women's rights movements at home, right? So they weren't known to be, advocates for women's rights at home in Europe, but they all of a sudden become advocates for those same rights abroad. We have, through many works, especially Malik Alula's The Colonial Harem, works that show how colonial officers exploited their positions of power to unveil Muslim women, right? And this idea of veiling to unveiling as a sign of going from tradition to modernity, I think needs to be really thought about, right? Our ideas about tradition, and again, tradition being seen as negative, and the opposite of that being modern, being progressive. This has been mapped out onto those very bodies, right? So Muslim women who are veiled or who wear different modes or different styles of head coverings are seen as traditional, and those who are not in those head coverings are seen as modern. And part of colonial history has the effort, both in terms of a kind of Orientalist imagination and colonial practices, have seen how this unveiling has happened. So, as I mentioned, the Colonial Harem, Malik Alula's work shows how colonial officers, for example, French officers would go into Algeria and other parts of North Africa and the rest of the world, where they would force women to unveil and take pictures and use them as trophies, as wartime trophies, right? And send these postcards back home when they knew it was obviously a violation of their rights. This kind of colonial feminism and colonial history is not unrelated to the kind of imperial efforts in modern times in this kind of saving narrative of Muslim women, right? The war in Afghanistan was launched on these same premises. All of a sudden, as the colonial officers did in the past, George Bush at that time became the champion of women's rights in Afghanistan. And Laura Bush and the feminist majority, they all kind of waged this war in Afghanistan with the premise that the Taliban were oppressing these women. The burqas came to public life. We started understanding more about this. Again, erasing the long history of the ways in which we have been embedded in those histories, right? As I mentioned at the outset, European history and Western history is often presented as a singular history. And what I would argue, as many others have, is that we need to see this history, European history, as mutually constitutive of the colonized. You can't see the history of the colonizer without thinking simultaneously about the colonized and the co-produced histories, right? You can't think about Afghanistan today and its relationship to the US without thinking about Afghanistan 10, 20, or 30 years ago and its relationship to the West, right? At one moment in history, the Taliban are brought over by Reagan and paraded as these are like the founding fathers of America. In another point in history, they're seen as the oppressors, right? So we have to recognize that the way in which we relate to the world is often related to the geopolitics of our time, right? And that we have to understand that these multiply, the ways in which people live out their lives is intimately tied to the ways in which we live our own, right? And I think it's a very important point because we often forget that the fact that people find themselves in certain parts of the world in certain conditions that they live in, we often make essentialist arguments about, oh, they're just like that because that's culture or that's their religion. They just behave like that. And then we can say the same thing about Muslims that we do today that we did 1,400 years ago, right? And I think it's really critical to do at least two things. One is to think about the conditions that we've created in the world today in which other people find themselves, right? And the second part of that is to think about our co-produced histories, that we are, as Judith Butler's work showed, it's too late. We don't live separate lives. We are too embedded in each other's histories, and I think that responsibility means that we have a responsibility to understand that those lives are intimately tied to ours. And there's, of course, issues of power in that. So this frame of women and gender and sexual minorities has often also been used in the West as kind of a test case of whether Muslims are liberal enough or not, right? Where you stand on certain kind of rights discourses, women's rights historically, and now increasingly sexual minority rights, are often the rights discourses that we use to recognize whether Muslims, both here and abroad, are seen as, again, progressive or not, American enough or not, or European enough or not, right? There's a lot of programs, for example, that we're seeing in Europe where Muslim men in particular are singled out to take lessons on how to behave properly as men, right? As if Islamic sort of patriarchy is particular to the Islamic tradition, forgetting, especially as we're seeing in all the stuff that's going on in this country right now, and the Me Too campaigns, that this is a global and historical phenomena that's not restricted to Islam and Muslims. Part of this frame also is the increased way in which sexual minority rights, where Muslims stand on women's rights, where Muslims stand on LGBTIQ rights, these are used as liberal test markers, again, of whether you are seen as progressive or regressive, and those have serious impacts in how people relate to you, right? So you could be making certain arguments academically, and someone in the class or in a public lecture doesn't hesitate to answer, well, where do you personally stand on these? And what does Islam say about this? And if Islam says something about this, they think that also is your position as a Muslim. So I think this needs to be questioned a little more, right? The ideas that we present that come from a certain place are not necessarily the ideas we might hold ourselves. And yet I see this kind of sort of choosing or picking out Muslims to respond to certain questions in a way that you don't see happening to other communities, right? So there's a kind of singling out that happens that you don't see amongst Christians and Jews. Even in my own experience at the GTU, right? Where do Muslims stand? I said, well, ask Muslims. Ask the sort of diversity of people. We don't actually hold official takes on things that, for example, at the Center for Islamic Studies, it's an academic platform. But there are other traditions that do hold official stances on these things. And they're often never asked, where do you stand on these same issues? So I think we need to question these kind of liberal tests. There are, as we know, these liberal tests have also been administered historically, and they continue in some settings. We know that in the Netherlands, they were giving, one of the test cases for citizenship was showing those who are applying for citizenship couples, homosexual couples who were engaged in sexual sort of acts of kissing and other things, and asking the applicants if they were comfortable with this or not, because this is what they should be comfortable with in the Netherlands, forgetting that many who already have citizenship might not be comfortable with it, or their religions other than Islam that may have different views on this. But these have actually been used in citizenship tests, right? We've seen this also being administered to refugees. Different status applied, people's refugee applications are enhanced, sped up, depending often on where they stand on certain kinds of rights discourse, right? So this should raise, I think, questions on how rights, and especially women's gender and sexual minority rights, have been used against Islam and Muslims. The fourth frame is the frame of Islam and the West, right? So I alluded to that a little bit about this kind of divisions of East and West, and Edward Said's work, if those of you who don't know it should. It's the 40th year anniversary of his work, and it's still very central to academia and beyond. But this idea of Islam in the West is also, it also brings up other questions, right? There's a lot in this kind of a binary around whether Muslim values or Islamic values are compatible with the West, right? Forgetting, again, the long history of Muslims being in the West and being Western, right? Whether it's Muslims in Bosnia, the African-American Muslims I mentioned here. So this question about whether Muslims can belong in the West or not is too late, you know? The nature of that belonging, you know, might be questioned, but then it should be questioned for everyone, right? To ask if Muslims in particular can be sort of, can live in the West, I think is, again, singling out a specific community and homogenizing that community, right? As if all people who adhere, all Muslims who adhere to the religion of Islam all think in the same way, all apply their understanding of Sharia in the same way. And this is another part of this Islam and West binary, right? That there's a kind of Sharia creep, that Sharia is taking over. And this is fueled not just by misunderstanding. So if one of the ideas is that if we just have more understanding, that somehow this will all go away, is hopeful. And I'm a big advocate of that, as I'll end my presentation with, I hope on a more hopeful note. But the idea is that it's not just a misunderstanding, that if people had a better understanding, it could be corrected. There's an actual industry out there, an Islamophobia industry, that perpetuates this kind of division. We have a president, number 45, who does this kind of perpetuation in public. So it gives license to all those to say we don't have to understand that there is a clash of civilizations, right? And that all the things that we're seeing around us point to that, right? So I think this binary of Islam and the West has to be questioned. This idea of a Judeo-Christian or Jewish or Judaic and Christian civilization needs to be put into a longer kind of history, including one, as Professor Richard Bullitt has argued, to also make a case for Islam to be part of that understanding. That's the fourth frame of Islam in the West. And then the last frame is the Middle East. So if 9/11 is the kind of temporal frame that we use, the Middle East becomes the kind of geographical frame or zone through which we often think about Islam and Muslims, right? And when we think of the Middle East, as we see in today's news, it's often around Israel-Palestine, it's around politics, granted that, of course, as Islam's birthplace, the Middle East is important, the Arabic language is important, but often when we're looking at the Middle East, it's a political situation and not the kind of aesthetic or scientific contribution of Arabs and Muslims to the West, right? We sort of skip that history, and it's often just a political history that we often tell. And then that of course forgets that most Muslims don't live in the Middle East and ideas around that. So what these sort of frames often do is it divides us into this kind of good and bad Muslims. In the interest of time, I'm just going to read some of the sort of analysis that I think is important here, and also the ways in which some of these frames get unpacked in my own classroom. In class, we unpack these totalizing frames, and this is, again, my classrooms at the GTU in a kind of theological institution where, again, our academic study of Islam is carried out in the midst of students who are MDiv students, MTS students, there who are just there to study Islam academically, but chaplains, people who want to use their knowledge of Islam in different contexts. So we unpack these totalizing frames and discuss how difficult it is to work outside of them, given the risks of being unrecognizable or apologetic. We often begin with the language we use, such as progressive, moderate, fundamentalist, including unpacking other English terms, as I mentioned, like jihad, madrasa, Taliban, Al-Qaeda. We also focus on how to unlearn and challenge the predominantly Christian lenses through which we attempt to understand the Islamic tradition. For example, not imposing the methodologies of biblical hermeneutics on Quranic studies, or how religious norms are often liberating in many communities around the world, challenging liberal and/or secular norms and values, or how not to dismiss feminisms that might base their liberation in the Quran and the prophetic tradition. Or, for example, when I'm trying to get my students to think about how Islam is mobilized and instrumentalized to make claims about religious violence in the world, I challenge them to think on how not to think about Islam, religion, and theology alone, but instead focus on the historical, socio-political, and economic context, and as I mentioned, the military-industrial complex in this globalized world. This takes a lot of imagination on my already diverse students, who even in their care and sensitivity often find it difficult to extend themselves to thinking beyond the confines of Euro-American Christianity, secularism, and liberalism, which present themselves as universal. And I would just, add to this that we also work in English, a colonial language that is now universal, right? So that's an entire other dimension of the homogenizing of the world, right? And just we think of the world through English. Having international students present or students from different traditions adds significantly to the breadth and depth of class discussions. There's also a difference in the way class discussions are experienced by Muslims and non-Muslim students, and those who are in Islamic studies and those who are studying Islam or other traditions from different academic disciplines or perspectives. And often, it is not just students alone that need the opportunities to learn about Islam and Muslims, but also faculty, administrative leaders, and leaders and religious leaders. We must be willing to ask the difficult questions of our own traditions that we so confidently ask others, and become aware of the biases we hold that we often reproduce in the larger political media frames that I mentioned. For example, at the GTU, many tend to think that because we are a progressive consortium, this makes us automatically more inclusive. In my experience, this has not always been the case. First and foremost, there is a profound ignorance about the history of exclusion of Islamic studies in theological schools and the secular academy in the United States, which, if better known, would help theological schools and seminaries understand the need for traditions to also be studied normatively and confessionally, like Christianity and Judaism. So one of the examples is, one of the things that we say is that, can't Muslims have enough critical distance from their own traditions? And this has been a question that has sort of been part of the history of how to think about Islamic studies, Islam and Muslims within the American Academy of Religion, for example, or the history of religions, right? Can scholars of Islam who are Muslim and who are practicing be objective enough in their scholarship? It's a question that continues to be part of the academy today. And I always first highlight the fact that there has been no historical equivalent of the way in which Islamic studies has been studied normatively and confessionally in theological schools in the West, like Christianity has and Judaism has. There have been no theological schools and divinity schools where Muslims are doing their work, right? We're just starting to see that. We're just starting to see Islamic studies now in divinity schools and theological schools. But otherwise, practicing Muslims who have academic questions, but also normative questions of a tradition, have only done their work in secular institutions. This is a profoundly different experience for those in other traditions, namely in Christianity and Judaism. Interestingly, at the GTU, in my own experience, it's often the more liberal ministries claiming to be the most inclusive that have set up the most obstacles in our diverse academic study of Islam, often subjecting us to liberal identity politics and practice of faith issues that are part of their ministries, in particular denominational and ideological approaches, rather than our focus at the center, for example, for the underrepresented scholarly tradition of Islam and Muslim diversity in the academy. Indeed, while we are becoming more publicly aware of the systematic systematic production and dissemination of Islamophobia by the right, we tend to overlook the left because it often presents itself as working in the interest of Islam and Muslims. Drawing on rich scholarship, especially in post-colonial and decolonial studies and methodologies, including in anthropology and critical theory, some of my own work and critique of Christian ministries in theological schools focuses on the particular ways that discussions on women, gender, feminism, and sexuality have been mobilized by the Euro-American left to discipline and exert power over Islam, Muslims, and Islamic studies in its own selective liberal image. This reproduces a colonial process of divide and rule and creates an index of good and bad Islam and Muslims. Islamophilia, befriending and promoting Muslims that uphold liberal values, and Islamophobia and intimidation for those who resist or provide nuance through their critique. I have to read this. I think some of you know this already. The book, the edited volume by Andrew Shryock, Islamophobia, Islamophilia. This is a paragraph that he has on a good Muslim, bad Muslim. The good Muslim as a stereotype has common features. He tends to be a Sufi, ideally one who reads Rumi. He is peaceful and assures us that jihad is an inner spiritual contest, not a struggle to enjoin the good and forbid the wrong through force of arms. He treats women as equals and is committed to choice in matters of hijab wearing and never advocates the covering of a woman's face. If he is a she, then she is highly educated, works outside the home, is her husband's only wife, chose her husband freely, and wears hijab, if at all, only because she wants to. The good Muslim is also a pluralist, recalls fondly the ecumenical virtues of medieval Andalusia, and is a champion of interfaith activism. He is politically moderate, an advocate of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, an opponent of armed conflict against the US and Israel, and finally, he is likely to be an African, a South Asian, or more likely still, an Indonesian or Malaysian. He is less likely to be an Arab, but as friends of the good Muslim will point out, only a small portion of Muslims are Arab anyway. So fundamentalist and self-selecting are these unquestioned liberal norms and markers, and so totalizing are their myopic frames, that efforts in reframing liberal politics puts Islam and Muslims on trial. This raises important theological and academic questions in terms such as how do we understand colonial conceptions and practices of time and space embedded, as I mentioned before, in terms like progressive and universal, so intrinsic to ministry, mission, and empire, colluding on the left and right. How are Western liberalism, secularism, and the Judeo-Christian civilization reconfigured vis-a-vis Islam and Muslims, especially using the frames of law and citizenship? What can anthropological discussions on native informants, savage, and salvation still teach us? And by what stretch of the American imaginary and under what conditions and limits can we make possible expanded norms of recognition of Islam and Muslim life? And perhaps most importantly, how do we rethink the power inherent in the production and dissemination of knowledge? I think such questions are important to continue asking as we build programs in Islamic studies, and even more so in interreligious studies, so that we begin seeing how discriminating our sets of questions are when it comes to different traditions. While difficult questions are welcome and necessary to advance scholarship and understanding, the larger concern here is what often presents itself in the language of diversity or calls for diversity, or are really what I experience as liberal forms of Christian proselytizing, or what I have called elsewhere liberal fundamentalism and conversion. I know it's a provocative statement, but I welcome that further discussion in the Q&A. Singling out students who happen to be Muslim and singling out their Muslim identity over other identities and asking where they stand on certain issues just recently being discussed in the US and European contexts is why such parochial questioning is Euro-American centric and on Euro-American time. Liberal tests, as I mentioned, are the new ways liberals create classes of good and bad Muslims by reserving these particular kinds of scrutinizing to Islam and Muslims. As Professor Sabah Mahmood has suggested, we need to question liberalism too. I would add, we should also question liberalism's exclusions, its deceits and limits, its claim to universality, and its claim to liberate all people. In conclusion, we live in perilous and precarious times marked by violence, war, terrorism, refugees and displacement, poverty and growing economic disparities, environmental catastrophes, the building of walls, racism, gender discrimination, xenophobia, and growing Islamophobia. This includes state-sponsored countering violent extremism programs and surveillance of Muslim communities, the monitoring and curtailing of religious and academic freedoms, and the consistent underrepresentation and misrepresentation of Muslims in mainstream media, politics, and beyond. In this post-truth era of alternative facts, fear, rage, the new nativism, and the rise of white nationalism in the United States and parts of Europe, Islam and Muslims occupy a strange national platform through which Islamophobia and Islamophilia can be expressed and mobilized by both those for and against Trump's bans, walls, profanities, and exclusions. Within the last year or so in the United States, Muslim women in hijab went from most often being seen as oppressed to temporarily becoming the face of freedom in the 2017 Women's March. In response to Trump's Muslim ban, and we've seen that being now upheld amongst other bans, people of all backgrounds came together in solidarity and protests at airports throughout the country where public prayers were welcomed. Public sites became venues for public expressions in support of pluralism and patriotism in solidarity with Muslims. But while we have seen such apparent Islamophilia in the past, it is usually short-lived. And Muslims and other minorities know all too well how such solidarity can be temporary, contingent, and political. As we often hear, Islam and Muslims become a way by which white liberals can vent their frustration at Trump. As many ask, would any of this have happened if Hillary Clinton became president? And yet, this painful lesson is now ironically forcing the nation to face itself and its history of denials and exclusions. In the spirit of learning and dialogue, it is important to advance scholarship and critique and to continue asking and addressing difficult questions in the privilege of our classrooms and public programs such as these that prepare us for an unpredictable world. I often remind my Christian colleagues that much of what they say and do needs to be in dialogue with and kept in check by the communities they claim to include. If we extend our interreligious studies outside our comfortable context, we quickly begin seeing our biases, the limits of our rhetoric, and the often white Christian liberalism, which is a profoundly different experience in communities of color. This means attending to issues of power and place, the where of interfaith, and being mindful that the assumptions we make in one context and the positions we take in one context will be challenged in other contexts. The presence of Islam and Muslims is critical today in theological schools and seminaries, not only for the reasons of historical exclusion, but also to acknowledge the profound contributions to Western civilization. Islam is an American religion, here right from the time African Muslims were enslaved in the Americas during the Atlantic slave trade, and has a long struggle and rich history of African American Muslims who have upheld the faith, as mentioned before. Islam and Muslims make significant contributions to how we collectively reflect upon ourselves in profoundly new ways in interreligious and interdisciplinary contexts where we study and live our faiths. Islamic studies is not just an add-on to how we think about, teach, and practice interreligious studies, it is integral to it. We need to study and reflect on the Islamic tradition in its own specificity and history, and we need to do so in the context of mutually constitutive histories of overlap, entanglement, and messiness, but also histories of shared intellectual and spiritual learning. This is my CIS plug, the Center for Islamic Studies plug. The Center for Islamic Studies exemplifies the critical role that Islamic studies and Muslims play in theological schools and the larger academy. In my own context, as we reflect on the CIS's first decade, and I'm so honored that our former president, Dr. Jim Donahue, who helped establish the center is here, along with Dr. Jane Purinton as well. Thank you both for being here. As we reflect on the CIS's first decade and think to the years ahead, addressing the challenges we face today and anticipate in the future, the Center for Islamic Studies provides and facilitates opportunities for dialogue at a time of heightened divisions nationally and internationally. To date, our 45 MA and PhD students and graduates in Islamic Studies, along with our faculty and visiting scholars and research scholars, bring vast experiences and histories that transform the GTU and beyond, coming from 17 countries and speaking, reading, or writing 32 languages. This is a remarkable global diversity that characterizes Islamic Studies at the GTU. There are major contributions that the study of religion and religions, in the plural, in theological contexts can jointly make. Because interreligious education aims to equip students with skills and professional competencies of sensitively navigating commonalities and differences within and across traditions, we have the opportunity as a group of scholars and faith practitioners to advance the positive role of religion in academia and public life, in media, the arts, museums, public policy, law, social justice work, business, and religious communities. I think of this work as mediation, translation, and boundary crossing, as it reframes religions and religious practitioners as sources of divisiveness to ones that promote dialogue and understanding through critical engagement. Advancing religious and interreligious literacy in theological schools, which includes understanding people in their intersectionality and understanding things in their historical, social, geopolitical, and economic contexts, has a tremendous transformative potential in the academy and the larger public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jiwa. Before we get into questions from the audience, I am going to take my own privilege of being an MC and ask a question to Dr. Jiwa to kick it off. But I have actually 10 questions, but I won't go through all because your talk was quite thought-provoking. I loved what you had to say about the European and the East and West and the binary and that the dominant view of what the European is becomes universal, where you started this talk. I thought it was great. And of course, secularism itself, there's a lot of questions I have about that, but secularism itself seems to me like a dogma. It seems to be anti-dogmatic when it comes to religious people, but they actually have a dogma of their own, in a sense. But the thing that really interests me, the question I want to ask you really, it has to do with the framing, the frames that you talked about. And I'll give you one quick thing, which is I had the honor of working with an author as a book editor, working with George Lakoff, who was at UC Berkeley, who did a lot of work on cognitive framing. And he had this fantastic little book called Don't Think of an Elephant. For those of you who haven't heard of it, that was the title of the book, and that was a question he used to ask his classes on the first day of class. He would begin by saying, don't think of an elephant. And he'd pause and he'd say, what happened when I said that? Everybody thought of an elephant. So the point being that if you are, and I remember I came to this country in 1974 in time to see Richard Nixon leave the White House. And one of his famous lines was, I'm not a crook. And what did their whole country think watching it on television? You're a crook. So my question is really about frames. And so if you're talking about frames that include, for Islam, that include violence, that include, subjugation of women, that include, this whole binary of Islam and the West. One of the lessons I learned from George Lakoff was that if you try to negate a frame, you reinforce the frame. If I stand up here and say, Muslims are not terrorists, I've just done exactly I've reinforced that frame of terrorism, right? So the question really is, how do you begin the answer seems to be to create new frames, rather than sort of challenge or try to negate the frames that are on there. And how do you begin to do that? And you mentioned a little bit towards the end of your talk about that, but I'd like to hear any thoughts you have about how do we, as Muslims and about Islam, begin to change the frame of Islam and of Muslims, and create new frames that don't have anything to do with those things, but that have to do with a lot of other amazing things about Muslims and Islam. Huh? No, this is my question, and I will see if other people have questions. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Safir, for that question. So yes, Lakoff's work, I think, is really important. And he says frames are the kind of cognitive structures through which we think about the world, right? And reframing is very hard because it actually asks us to think about the world in different ways, which is very difficult. I would argue that reframing is very difficult. I mean, he talks about it in a political context, and his work, if those of you who haven't read it, is really, really important. But one of the things is that reframing is very hard to do because there's a kind of a national and political inertia of the frames that are already present. Right? So when you think of refugees, you already think in a certain way. When you think of, just say the word walls, you think in a certain way. It's not just about the reframing, because it's very hard to do. As I mentioned, once you reframe, you're either seen as an apologetic. Oh, I'm going to use Islamic art. Well, yes, I actually think Islamic art needs to be part of the conversation, and the entire contribution of Islamic aesthetics to the West, or scientific contributions. But that's read as apologetic because people will say, well, that's just the past. That doesn't answer for all the violence in the world. So there are dominant frames, I think, that are in the world that we have to work through. And reframing is very hard because, again, it's either seen as you've missed the point, or you haven't actually spoken about violence, because that's usually the elephant, so to speak, in the room. Or it's just seen as, it's just seen as apologetic, that you're not really dealing with the frame in question. So what I offer is that we have to be more nuanced in the frames that we use. We have to fill in those frames with different ways in which to see the world, right? I use the kind of dominant lens of violence and fundamentalism, but we have to, as I said, put them in different kinds of historical, social, geopolitical perspectives, right? So we don't just think about violence any particular way, or violence as belonging to a certain group of people, that some are victims of it and some are the oppressors. I think there are different ways in which we have to nuance those frames. I mean, that's one argument. The frame of women, gender, and sexual minorities. It sounds apologetic, but we can sort of tease those out by saying, well, yes, there have been more Muslim women presidents and leaders in the Muslim world than there have been in the West, right? Now, it sounds apologetic, but it's true, and it's an important fact, right? Or the fact that the Islamic Republic of Pakistan has recognized the third gender. Does that all of a sudden make Pakistan more progressive? Does it mean that it's way ahead of the curve in terms of the U.S. in its ability to do that? So you can be recognized as third gender on identity cards in Pakistan, the Islamic Republic, right? But when we think Islamic Republic or an Islamic state, we already think certain things. It's already scripted for us. So I think part of our task in academia and beyond is to nuance those frames, is to provide different ways in which people actually live their lives. The other is the fact that we live within these large frames, but how people actually live their lives is so nuanced and is so complex, right? These frames don't tell us much about what people's lived experiences are. They don't tell us what people's emotions are. They don't tell us how people embody certain kinds of ethical or moral habits, right? I think those are all really important ways in which we nuance the frames. It's very hard to think outside of them. When I start talking about, as I said, Islamic art and architecture and the marvels of the Islamic tradition this way, people find it very hard to digest that. And yet there's a need for it, and yet there are people who absolutely love this, but it's seen as often apologetic. So I think it's just about the nuance that we have to add. Thanks for your question. Can you? Okay.
I'm going to use the opportunity to give one more plug, since you mentioned Islamic art. In 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks actually, in a week and a half from today, on Sunday, December 17th, right here at Zaytuna College, we're going to have an event And the title of the event is A Silent Theology of Islamic Art. It's actually the title of an article that we're publishing in the journal, the Renovation Journal, which is the journal of Zaytuna College, by a scholar at the College of William and Mary. And he's going to be here along with 2 practitioners of Islamic art, and we're going to have a discussion about that. I think you answered my question very well. I think we have some questions from online. If you do have some, Haroon, we can start with those, or there's a question in the audience here, we can start with that. Thank you.
Asalaamu Alaikum. I just wanted to know if you could speak a bit more on the departmental divisions that kind of push Islam kind of out to the side of traditional Western academic institutions, and maybe offer some advice to students that are either already attending or planning on attending a Western academic institution to study Islam and Muslims in a traditional academic field, as opposed to within fields and departments such as Islamic Studies or Religious Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, etc., and the best way to navigate such an academic environment.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks again, Mohammed, for helping put this event together. So I think it's an important question, and I know we get some of these questions a lot, and people are trying to navigate how to think about Islamic studies. So I'm not one of those people who say don't study Islam in the Western Academy. I know there are many who advocate that. I actually think that it's important that scholars who happen to be Muslim, who want to study Islam, should do so in a variety of fields, whether it's Near Eastern studies, Middle East studies, religious studies, anthropology, my own field, sociology, literature. I think these are the diverse ways in which we can benefit from a large kind of body of knowledge. So I think it's important to see oneself as being able to be part of these. It's not restricted to any one discipline. The field historically has been divided between those who kind of do what used to be called Oriental studies or Orientalism, philological work, text-based work. What historically has always been sort of divided is the great and little traditions. So, textual, philological studies happen on the one hand, and then more anthropological sort of little traditions happen on the other, so the practices and the texts, or the texts and context. That has, by and large, been questioned. I mean, even though we have departments that kind of uphold that, it's been questioned. I think there's a more kind of integrative approach to thinking about even the texts that we study should be thought of contextually, historically, and if relevant today. So I think that students who are thinking about doing this, who happen to be Muslim, should see all of these as opportunities, and I think increasingly see opportunities in theological schools and divinity schools where there is an opportunity to study confessionally, normatively. It's not always easy to navigate, but we can do so also in the context of other traditions, and I think that's really important. I think having the ability to study our own traditions in the context, a place like GTU, for example, it's an amazing opportunity to be able to study Islam textually, normatively, confessionally, but to also be with Christians, Jews, others in the class, those who are not confessional, to ask these questions in a sensitive way. And that doesn't preclude being critical. I think that has to be included as part of this, So I think it's not an either or. I think that one should see all of these places as opportunities. And then again, different disciplines and different departments have different methodologies. The one department that I can't make a plug for increasingly, at least in its kind of move towards more sort of security studies, is political science. I mean, a lot of funding around Islam and Muslims is going to political science in kind of security and terrorism studies, right? This is sort of changing the way, I mean, it has departments competing with each other, and within those departments there are people who think, in different ways. But I think that this is now part of how people think about the sort of larger Islamic studies. And then I think it's just wonderful, the work that Zaytuna College is doing as a liberal arts college, with, inshallah, a graduate program coming up, to be able to study a classical tradition normatively in the same way that other traditions have been given that opportunity. So I think that that's also an amazing thing. It's not for everyone, you know. People might not want to do the classical studies. Come to GTU if you don't want to do the classical stuff. And if you want to do the classical stuff, come to, you know, so I think there's a lot of opportunity. And we're seeing that right here on Holy Hill, right? With Zaytuna College, with GTU, and with UC Berkeley, a public university, where there's an increased interest in public theology. The Luce Foundation, for example, has just funded the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. They're increasingly doing work with us here at Zaytuna, at GTU. I think these are ways in which we can have conversations across disciplines which are not so isolating for people who think of themselves as religious and therefore not having a space in a secular context. I think that that's changing. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about the frames that you were talking about and temporality. So much of what you talked about is very much rooted in a particular type of political unit, so in modern nation states. And so I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between nation-building projects and some of the frames that you're speaking of, because in my own work in the pre-modern periods, some of the very frames that you're speaking of, you find that kind of discourse in pre-modern texts, and so I'm wondering if you see any kind of fundamental sort of shift when you do get the rise and kind of establishment of nation states, or is that not a necessarily significant transitional moment?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Thanks, Dr. Sabat. You know, I think that one of the ways in which the clash of civilizations sort of binary works is that a lot of the sort of antagonisms between what we have come to call Islam and the West are age-old antagonisms, right? That Muslims have always thought of themselves outside of the fold of Europe, and Europeans have always thought of themselves, and this is just a kind of propensity towards a clash. So the things that we can say today about Islam and Muslims in the West is the same things that we are often saying even prior to the Crusades. So that's one line of argument, that the clash is based on these age-old divisions, right, and the age-old demarcations of space and time, you know, both this kind of spatial and temporal markers. But I think the difference within modern nation states, which is very recent, is that these are now nation-building projects. You know, as Professor Assad's work shows, that secularism is a certain kind of political doctrine. So it demands people to behave in certain ways, right? You're demanded to behave in a certain way. You're regulated by time in new ways that you weren't in pre-modern times, right? As I mentioned, the example of prayer. Your days, for many people personally, their day could be marked by prayer, but the public sphere is not navigated by your prayer time. Prayer time has to be a religious accommodation that's made in a secular sphere. That might not be a bad thing, but when that's the only way of seeing the world, and that's the only way in which we can think of people living decent lives, and then we have all sorts of regulatory bodies that tend to work in people's interests, but or claim to at least, those add to the ways in which we are moving, or there's a kind of propensity towards a homogenization of how we live our lives, right? So the UN or World Bank and all these other international bodies create certain kinds of ways in which we all are supposed to inhabit the same space and time. The other part of that is that we, as Mahmoud's work shows, there's a sense that we think that our way of life is the best way of life. We can't imagine that there are other life worlds that have different kinds of histories, that can coexist, that do coexist, that we live in different languages. You know, I think that these are really important points to bring up, the kind of particular ways in which people attempt to live their lives. So as an anthropologist, I'm interested both in, you know, what are these large frames of temporality and space, and how do we find ourselves in that? And then just everyday stories of how someone lives their life. And you'll see that these can be vastly different, right? I don't know if it gets to the heart of your question, but there are sort of what we would call the same frames that keep reemerging, but how they're employed, how they're mobilized look very different in different historical moments. And right now, the kind of presentist social media world that we live in, again, is another kind of homogenizing of the world. So on the one hand, we think of ourselves as being much more aware of each other. There's an ability to be in contact in ways we hadn't historically, but along with that are major things that we should be concerned with, right? And again, social media is another way in which a form of universal, a kind of universalizing of the world happens, and most are still excluded from that, right? Including, I didn't even get on the kind of economics of all of this, but the kind of economic exclusions that happen as a result of that. A long whirlwind of an answer, but hopefully we can continue. Safir, can we take a question?
If I could take a question from online. As a non-Muslim, now being made aware of these frames, but who continues to watch lots of TV, what's the fundamental thing or questions I must ask myself when consuming media reports about Islam and Muslims?
Wow, it's hard because if you say, well, be wary of the news, you sound like number 45, right? So I don't want to sound like him. But yes, be critical in the way we consume our news and get it from multiple sources, right? Print, TV, speaking to people, visiting communities. I mean, I think we really need to diversify the way in which we think about our sources of information. The other I would add to that is that shouldn't be the only place we go for our information about a tradition. This is like 1,400 years of history, 1,400 plus years of history in the Islamic tradition that is vastly diverse, that is complex, and that the news media shouldn't be our go-to place to learn about this. We need to read, we need to diversify the languages we know, and I think we need to do that with each other's traditions. I think it's really critical that the ability for us to see our own traditions in nuanced ways, the complexity of our traditions, we all get that. I think we all get how messy our traditions are, right? And how we relate to them. What Talal Asad calls, that it's, he says that part of the problem, at least in the academy, of how to study Islam is that we don't have the kind of conceptual frameworks. We don't have the right conceptual tools, right? It's not just, Islam is not just, as I said, the textual tradition, which is just the Quran and Sunnah. It has to be an interpretive one as well. And Islam is not just whatever any Muslim says it is, right? He says it's, we're lacking the conceptual tools of this text and context, and he offers what he calls an Islamic discursive tradition. It's the various ways in which we relate in various times and places to the foundations of the tradition, which are the Quran and Sunnah, and the multiple ways in which we relate to that. And the multiple ways which we relate to that are specific, historically specific, politically specific, socially specific. So I think that that's sort of one way of thinking about it. The other is just read voraciously, read other stories, and read the right things, because there's a lot of course, academic works that are also problematic. I think we need to read, we can offer lists, you can go down to the websites, but yes, I think it's an important thing to move from a source like television for our news media to multiple sources, and included in that are academic sources to kind of give us the sort of nuance. The other often people offer is that, well, meet a Muslim, hang around with a Muslim. I say, well, that also can be problematic, but then you're left with this, well, you better meet the right kind of Muslim, and then you open up the whole can of worms of who's the right kind of Muslim. So, but it is, I think, important. There's a lot of good work that's being done with a lot of Muslim-led organizations that's sort of advancing this opportunity to meet with one another and to learn about one another. And it doesn't have to always be on things theological. What our texts say might be one area of interest, but it can be on joint projects of any kind. Water issues, poverty issues, homelessness, environment. There are many things that we often do just work on together. So thanks for your question. Dr. Brownie?
Coming in at this point, perhaps you want to end, but Dr. Jiwa, many of the thoughts you shared got me thinking about the frames itself, and as I am a student of pre-modern Islam more than contemporary, which we all have to live, but I was thinking that if one thinks about knowledge production and the society, then there is a series of 10 films that were done which are titled When the World Spoke Arabic. Exactly the same kind that we are looking at today, the domination of Western sciences and knowledge production that then seems to be linked with the temporal and the spatial that you were talking about. There was a time that the world rhythm was Arabic. If you were to take between Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba and Granada, knowledge production happened in those parts of the world that happened to be Arabic and Muslim, that pursued knowledge when most of Europe was in the Dark Ages. And so inevitably, those rhythms and the temporal and the spatial was dominant in the world of the time, the known world of the time, exactly within the frames that you were describing. So as you were talking about it, I wondered what is different, right? So the analysis is very important, and for Muslims to think about there being that kind of a frame, in some ways, one could argue simplistically that imperialistic mind frames do have a dominant impulse. And then there is the knowledge production that somehow fits into it, albeit in our times now, the globalization, the internet, all of that makes a very different case for it, right? So how do you think, and despite that, I'm reminded of many, many texts that I teach where people were interested in other parts of the world, even though they lived in the dominant knowledge production societies. They were Ibn Battuta, you're talking of Biruni. These are people that either went to India and learned the languages and somehow tried to understand their tradition with other very formidable traditions. And so Nasir Khusro, these are travelogues that we think about that went to other parts of the world. So is there that lack which comes into what is now nativism and nationalisms? Is that one of the frames to look at? And how do then we look at the frames that are dominant now? How do we look at our own traditions and compare where there could be, as someone has said, we're not all born with pluralist impulse. They are learned. And those learnings happen when there is enough curiosity and not insular traditions, right? So, of course, you and I agree that one of the most important interventions, for lack of time, that you didn't mention is Shihab Ahmed's work, What is Islam?, where he talks about the Balkans to the Bengal phenomenon, where Muslims live very, very diverse lives, right? So coming back to your question in terms of sort of frameworks and how, in order to counter those frameworks, you often end up reiterating some of it, and then your suggestion was nuance. I recently, just yesterday, day before, came back from Egypt, and it was very interesting even to see among Muslims. This was a Muslim group from the UAE visiting Egypt for the first time, and one of the persons that said at dinner was really interesting for me, who is very much now believer of an experiential education. She said to me, the one thing that's already changed in my 3 days here is I will never look at the Egyptians the same way. I have met Egyptians in the UAE, and I have had not the best of experience with Egyptians compared to the real Egyptians that I see in Egypt. And I will never look at the Egyptians in a biased way that I did based on the 3 people that I met, right? So what you have here is an increasing interest in allowing the dialogic frameworks to work in a way. But again, looking at those dominant frameworks that you're talking about, I'm very much reminded of those, the pre-modern ones. And I wonder how one has to, in some ways, accept certain frameworks that are dominant because they're knowledge production society, wherever that knowledge was produced. And how within that, then, to look at different rhythms that work for different parts of the world. And obviously people, when they go to that part of the world, do get converted and like their afternoon siestas and don't want to work 9 to 5, right? After a good lunch, you sleep, and then you work from 5 to 8 again. So, again, the whole question is, how do we then interpret those frameworks? But I wanted to bring some of the pre-modern perspective, particularly with Dr. Sabah's question of whether nation states does that, and the more current ones in terms of how globalization works in a very different way, where on the one hand, the irony of knowing everything at your fingertips, and the exact opposite happening where people want to go into their own frames, because that's exactly what makes them comfortable, right?
I thank you, Dr. Nargis Farhani, who's one of our longest visiting scholars, research scholars, along with Carol Beer, who I think the two of them have been the longest visiting scholars with us. So thank you for all the work you've been doing. It's not a response to that, so I think you lift up a lot of really important points, and how do we think about the frames in pre-modern and modern times, as Dr. Sabat was also mentioning. I mean, I don't see these as, what I'm offering, I hope, is not a kind of a political intervention, but more of a kind of a case for the humanities and a kind of aesthetic sensibility, an ethical sensibility of how we think about the world, right? And that has to be nuanced, I think. As I said, in this kind of presentist political environment, and the corporatization of our universities and institutions, there's very little room to actually think about nuance, to bring to excluded histories into parlance, because it's very instrumentalist. If you're going to be talking about 8th, 10th century, it better be relevant to something you're doing today. Otherwise, it just doesn't make it anymore, doesn't cut it anymore, and it's not funded anymore. That's another big part of it, right? The funding sort of pushes us into how we think about these different frames. But I think you raise a really important question about how do these frames change and travel? Does travel help those frames? Do we think in more nuanced ways about the world? It's hard to do that because, one of the pitfalls of the advocating for pluralism is then what do we do with societies that aren't, or that are largely a culture or a language? We know that no society is completely like that, but that are predominantly of a culture, right? Many nation states kind of fought against that. We fought against what nation states that were tied to an ethnicity are now plural. So what it means to be German today could be German citizenship, but there are people who also say being German is an ethnic identity, right? So a lot of what we're seeing in terms of today, in terms of loss that people are feeling in terms of their nation states, has a lot to do with how we have moved from nation states being tied to certain kinds of ethnic groups to nation states that are now thought of in terms of citizenship and how people can belong. So is it okay for me to say that I'm Canadian, or do I have to say where I'm really from? I guess I can do that in the US context. But these are, I think, questions that relate to what we do with societies that are pluralistic in their own way but might not appear pluralistic to us. Does that mean that they're regressive? Does that mean that they don't fit the modern world because their societies aren't plural? So there is a kind of sense that Americans get it right. I mean, the kind of American exceptionalism is that we are the most pluralistic country in the world, and that's amazing, and that is an incredible thing. At the same time, it's not without its own tensions. That's why you see increasingly people wanting to go in their own communities, because that's a place of comfort for them. It's a place of identity. It's a place of being sustained. It could be language as well. People just even living in a certain language, evoke certain things. But I think what I'm trying to advocate for is a certain kind of ability to recognize the multiplicity of the ways in which people live their lives as having validity and equal validity, and the fact that our way of life is not the only way of life for the world. An American way of life is not the way most people live their worlds, and it cannot be imposed through war and drones on people, or other kinds of institutions, UN, World Bank, and other things. So my worry is that this tendency towards a kind of homogenization of the world is kept in check by the everydayness of people's lives, the complexities, the joys, the sorrows, the lived experience of people. And I think there is something to be said about, how do we think about when Arabic was, in pre-modern times, when Arabic was a kind of worldview. Again, I think we need the nuance. We need to think about how people traveled, where they went. Yes, there were imperial powers as well. Yes, there was domination. So we need to think about all those complexities. I'm not offering a kind of political solution, except to say that there's maybe an ethical responsibility we have in offering the same kind of change and ability to see the nuance in others that we demand of ourselves. I can say it because you're here, but one of the ways in which, for example, there was a reference to Rumi as, he's the love poet, most beloved poet in the West, because his Muslimness is downplayed. And I still recall, Professor Virani, your sacred text lecture at the G2 Library in 2008, where you basically put Rumi back into the Islamic tradition, right? Rumi, who is also, whose work can be seen as tafsir, but who's also an Islamic legal scholar, right? That's not the Rumi that's represented. And one of the, I think, arguments that you made so profoundly is that Rumi is universal and universally appealing, not because he is moving beyond Islam, but because, in fact, his universalism is a result of his particular roots in the Islamic tradition and being Muslim. And I think that still resonates with me. So putting Rumi back into the tradition is the universality of Rumi, not the exception. So thank you for your question.
And Dr. Munir, if I could close with a couple final questions that I'm going to combine. Mm-hmm. Alan from Facebook asks, in a world where there are sectarian wars between Sunnis and Shia in this example, what role does religion play to unite us in an inclusive framework? And then what inspirations can we draw from to continue our efforts to be beautiful and share beauty while knowing that whatever we produce may end up in an ugly frame?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So one of my categories was, increasingly the tensions that we're seeing amongst Shias and Sunnis that often it could fit in any of the categories, but especially in the Middle East, and we think of increasingly that kind of violence in that part of the world. I would offer once again that that diversity within Islam has always been there. We need to look at the different political and historical moments in which those differences are exploited to create tensions. And I think that it would be, it's important not to say that these are just religious or theological tensions. Well, those theological differences are part of the tradition. That it's important to note the kind of political context in which those divisions are exacerbated. So we often hear today in Iraq, it's more divided than it was during Saddam's time. That's not all of a sudden because Muslims of different persuasions started hating each other. It's because there's a political context in which that unfolds, right? And we see that all around the world. Those tensions often bear on Sunni Shia and other relations in this part of the world as well, right? And I think it's important to recognize that diversity is part of the Islamic tradition. It's always been there. We look at people who want to go right back to the prophetic time, but also the Quran. Built into the Quran is, as God reminds us, is that diversity is part of how we are created, male and female nations and tribes, so that we know one another. So I think that this knowing one another is both important intra-Islamically amongst Muslims and interreligiously and outside of the tradition as well. I often see that people will exploit outside of the Islamic tradition. Non-Muslims will also often exploit the tensions within. And we do that with other traditions as well. I mean, I think it's a broad way in which we work about, exploiting the tensions within, so the fight remains there. There's lots of books that have kind of come out on saying the next phase of the tension is not with Islam in the West; it's within Islam, right? And so. I would again offer that we not see these as, we see religious differences and diversity as part of the tradition, with all its messiness, with all its beauty, but that we also see the socio-political context in which those differences are mobilized. And I hope that, that we arrive at, I mean, in some ways, maybe it's probably a good way to close, but, beyond just the surrender or the submission that many of us as Muslims aspire to, the kind of Islam, the surrender, and then the iman that comes with that, right? The cultivation of belief and the understanding of it, all towards a kind of ihsan, right? A kind of pursuit of beauty and excellence. And that is not restricted to any one person. That is for everyone. And so maybe that might be a way to close and say that a lot of these tensions have been historically there, they're current, they must be navigated, and they must be navigated in ways that, that are, again, both intra-Islamic and inter-religious as well. Is that good? Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jiwa, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight and those online joining us, and for the great questions as well. I think this brings to a close not only this evening, but also the fall lecture series of Zaytuna College. Rest assured that Zaytuna College will be firing up another lecture series come January, and there'll be more talks and more enlightening discussions, I hope. And I do want to remind everybody about the 10th anniversary of GTU tomorrow, of Islamic Studies, CIS, the Center for Islamic Studies. And also, while I'll put one more plug, and I don't feel bad about or ashamed about putting these plugs because none of us are here to make money out of it. This is a nonprofit setup. And considering the talk of pluralism and Islam and all of that, the new issue of Renovation, the journal we're putting out, which will be coming out in 2 weeks, the theme of that issue is actually tolerance and pluralism. And so I urge all of you who are interested in that topic, especially in context of Islam, to pick up a copy or read it online. With that, I hope you all have a safe journey home. And those of us joining us online, thank you very much. Asalaamu Alaikum and good night.